All right, it is 11 a.m. So we are going to go ahead and start our program. Welcome everyone to Understanding Pronouns, How to Get Them Right. My name is Kate Sugg and I'm a program administrator with the Westchester County Youth Bureau. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you could kindly remember to keep your computer, your microphone on mute, we would appreciate it. Our presenters will let you know when you can unmute to ask questions, or you can also use the chat feature. Also, we are recording this event. However, we will be pausing the recording when there's time for conversation and commentary. And I will now like to turn it over to our presenters from the Loft Community Center, Shepard Verbis and Kira Lingala, so we can get started.
All righty, let's dive right in. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today. My name is Shepard. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm here with Kira. Both of us will just introduce ourselves in just a second. But thank you so much for setting aside this next hour to talk about pronouns. As Kate said, we are going to have room for discussion. So I do want to invite you now, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat as we get going. Write them down to yourself if you prefer, and then we will be able to unmute and we will be able to talk about them. There will be time in the middle of our workshop to kind of pause for questions, and then there'll be time at the end, just in terms of structuring your brain around how we're doing this. Okay, so understanding pronouns, how to get them right. Here we go. So we're obviously here to talk about language, okay? Pronouns are a way that we use language. We say pronouns are the word that replaces your name in a sentence. I learned about them in second grade. I don't know about you. Most commonly, the pronouns that you hear are what we call binary pronouns, maybe, so like she, he, that is often linked to a binary gender identity. And I'll get into that a little bit in just a second. But I do want to invite us, as we're taking the time to be in this workshop space today, what we're really doing is kind of leaning into our allyship. I mean, because by being here, we're saying, hey, I'm committed to learning more about this topic that I might not know everything about, or that I know enough about, but I still want to be here and support it, right? And that's really being an ally, okay? And I applaud you for being here and doing that. Because as an ally, the words that we use really do matter, okay? And one of the most immediate and impactful things that we can do as a human supporting another human is use words that affirm them, right? I'm going to read a little quote to kind of get us kick-started in the discussion about pronouns and why this is important, to just kind of set a food for thought little moment here. So here it goes. This quote is from a book called Queer Theory, Gender Theory by Ricky Wilkins. The quote is, "Gender is language, a system of meanings and symbols, along with the rules, privileges, and punishments pertaining to their use. Language tends to name whatever is common or shared among members of a speech community, which is a way that language favors the same. And what is unique, unrepeatable, and private tends to go unnamed." Okay, that's the quote. I'm gonna let that sit for a second. What is language tends to favor the same, and what is unique, unrepeatable, and private tends to go unnamed. I'm centering that in the discussion today because we're talking about pronouns, which is language, which oftentimes is used synonymously and is linked to gender. So I want to invite us into a thought that says, not only what do they impact the words that I'm having have on those around me, what do they have on the perception of myself? Why do I use them? Where do they come from? okay? And how can I broaden my language to be as inclusive as possible, right? A lot of times pronouns might be new to you. The words people use for themselves might be something that you've never considered before or heard before. And that can feel a little daunting, stepping into being an ally to that person, right? But remember, typically language favors the same. And what we're doing by being an ally and affirming language that might be different is saying, I'm going to validate the fact that you're using words to make you not feel like an other, okay? To make you feel like a human being deserve it of respect, right? And honoring the fact that language evolves and that you're going to be there in that process. Cool. About us. So I'm the director of programs and services. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm a trans non-binary human being. I've been with the center for 6 years. I'm here with Kira. Kira, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, so I'm Kira Lingala, and I'm the peer navigator for the Loft's Proudest Me program, which is all about serving the transgender, nonconforming, and non-binary community. And I've been at the Loft since 2020.
Okay, and then a little bit about the center, right? I mean, I do kind of want to believe that lots of people here might know about the center, but just in case you're not familiar, the Loft is Westchester County's LGBTQ plus community center for people ages 18 and older. We do have programs that span the entire lower Hudson Valley. And currently, a lot of our programs are also running on Zoom, obviously. So they actually are international. But we do primarily serve Westchester County. We have over 40 different programs and services available to the community free of charge. They look like support groups, so peer designated support spaces for all different types of community, different demographics, for peers of that community to meet other peers of that community, led and facilitated by peers of that community, right? For example, like a 20-somethings group, which is led by an LGBT person in their 20s, an LGBTQ 55 plus group, if we're going in ages, right? Which is facilitated by an LGBTQ plus person who is 55 and older, so on and so forth. We also have social groups and activities, which welcome allies. If you're ever interested in, broadening your community and your friendship circle, you're welcome to join if you're an ally. But social groups and activities look like convening around a interest area or a hobby. Okay, so like a knitting circle, a pride chorus, a vegan potluck, things like that. Assistance and advocacy programs. This looks like connecting folks to resources. We actually have a program here that's been around since it predates our center, really. It's our helpline program, which folks can call, email, or drop into our center and access support and referrals to LGBTQ vetted resources in our area. We also do advocacy work, of course, around LGBTQ issues in our community. Health and wellness programs, including Westchester County's only LGBT senior program called Silver Connections for people 55 and older. We also do hiking, we do meditation, things like that. And of course, Proudest Me, which is the program that Kira is part of. Proudest Me is regional health and wellness service for transgender, nonconforming, and non-binary community members to access peer navigation and case management to help them achieve their goals. Education, which looks like trainings and other things like that, and special events, including Westchester County Pride and the Hudson Valley Trans Forum, which is an annual 2-day conference entirely focused on serving and empowering transgender, nonconforming, and non-binary community members. This is our info at the bottom if you want to learn more. Hope you do. All right, what are we doing today? Okay, so this is a little bit about what we're doing. In a nutshell, we're going to deconstruct some gender. We're going to talk about pronouns. We're going to talk about the how and the why and the how do you ask, and then we're going to get into discussion. Okay, we are breaking in discussion between part 1 and part 2. So there will be time again to ask questions. We do ask that when you do ask questions that you ask them respectfully and but also feel free to ask them. Okay. I know that that's like a juxtaposition, but like, please do feel free to ask questions here in this space. Kira and I are here to answer them. We want to be a resource for anybody who might have questions that they might not feel super safe asking to others. So please do ask them. And also, we're going to assume as a community here in this space, we're going to assume best intentions. Okay. So if you do ask a question, you're not sure how it's going to land, just know that everybody here in this space is not going to judge you for it. Okay. That's why we're here today. All right, cool. We're good? Everybody good? Yes? Love that? Yeah? Okay. All right, cool. Let's dive into gender. Okay. Of course, this workshop that we're doing today focuses on pronouns, right? However, we cannot fully have a conversation around pronoun use without first unpacking and debunking myths and misconceptions around gender, okay? Because oftentimes pronouns, the word that replaces your name in a sentence, and gender, your internal notion of yourself, are linked, okay? In other words, pronouns are often assumed to be exclusively used as a reflection of someone's gender. Okay. For example, someone that you know in your life that you know uses she, her pronouns. Automatically, our brain goes to she, her equals woman, right? Equals girl, equals female, right? So that's what I mean by linking gender and pronouns together is we say she, her, woman, he, him, man, they, them, non-binary, right? So that's why we're talking about gender. I want to also, though, invite us into a mindset of unlinking those two things, okay? Because it is often true that sometimes it is often true that she, her does link to woman and he, him does link to man. And that does happen, but not always, okay? There are plenty of people who don't identify as female who use she, her pronouns. There are also plenty of people who don't identify as non-binary and use gender inclusive pronouns like they, them, okay? So we're gonna talk about gender, but I don't want us to confuse it with pronouns. I want us to have an understanding of what gender is separately from pronouns so that we can talk about the way that pronouns help us to express gender, but don't always have to link to gender, okay? Okay. All right, but we're gonna debunk some myths first. So gender, what is it in the first place? There are often a lot of different misconceptions that come up when we say gender and people kind of like start thinking what that is. Number one, gender is the myth number one, gender is determined by one's biological sex characteristics. Okay, that's the myth. In reality, gender is a personal identity. Gender does not automatically exist due to a person's biology, right? And that means their physical body. And I'll explain that in a second with a little picture that we have. Myth number two, gender is the same throughout a person's life, right? If they're a girl as a kid, they will be a woman as an adult, okay? In reality, gender is fluid. We all have the freedom to explore it at our own rate. I am sure that how you felt about yourself in your relation to your body was different at 13 than it is now at 40, okay? I know the way that you expressed your gender at 3 years old with your tutus or your pickup trucks or whatever you were doing is different than how you're expressing your gender now, right? Gender is fluid, expression is fluid, and we need to leave space for people to explore it at their own pace. Myth number three, if you're really trans, you know this at a young age, okay? Reality, many trans people know that they're trans at a young age, but not everyone, okay? Sometimes people don't have language to say that they're trans. I didn't know that there was a word for how I felt about my gender until I was 18, 19, 20, I don't remember, something like that. I was not 3 or 4 years old, right? And also, sometimes people don't always have the freedom to express themselves, right? Especially not in childhood, right? If you're gender nonconforming, you might not always be in a welcoming environment that lets you express that, right? So we want to give space for people to come out whenever they're ready and whenever is right for them. And myth number 4, a person's pronouns always indicate their gender identity. Reality, pronouns are a great form of expression, but do not always reflect a person's gender. And we did already sort of talk about that, but we're definitely going to be exploring that further. Okay? All right, as promised, just to reiterate a little bit of the key points that I had mentioned just now, between the differences of sex and gender expression and all of these things, right? There can be a little bit of mixture, a little bit of confusion. Even, sometimes when we talk about the LGBTQ plus community as a whole, people get tripped up on the words, right? People say, gay rights, or they think that if you're trans, you're automatically gay, or vice versa, right? And there's like this kind of confusion between all of the things you can be in this beautiful rainbow spectrum that we have, right? I want to invite us into a place of understanding sexual orientation as separate from gender identity. Okay. Every single person has a relationship to gender, and every single person has a relationship to sexual orientation, sexual romantic orientation. Okay. Whether you're a part of the LGBTQ plus community or not, you yourself have a relationship to gender and a relationship to sexual and romantic attraction. Okay. Sometimes we think about these things and we think about pronouns and we say that's a trans issue, that's a queer issue, that doesn't affect me. If I don't work with LGBT clients, I won't ever have to think about this. But in reality, gender affects every single human being on this planet in different ways because we all live in a gendered world, right? So, inviting us into kind of thinking of this as a way that we can inform ourselves and explore ourselves, and then empower others to do the same. Okay, so that's what this knowledge is going to help us do, hopefully. So, kind of unpacking this a little bit further. Sex assigned at birth. All right, oftentimes, and this sex assigned at birth is your body. Okay, so your physical and genetic makeup. Oftentimes people link body to gender, right? And they say you have this body type, that must mean that you are this gender, right? So if you're assigned female at birth, you must identify as a woman. It's inherent. That's how the world works, right? When you do align your sex assigned at birth aligns with your gender, that is called cisgender. Okay. It is one way of being a person in this world, cisgender. Cisgender means on the same side, right? Cis is a Latin root, meaning on the same side. However, when your sex assigned at birth and your gender identity don't align, you might be trans, okay? And it's just as valid as being cis. It's just a different way of being in this world. Gender identity isn't your body. It isn't your body. It isn't your sex. It is how you think. It's how you feel. It's how you perceive yourself in relation to the world that you live in. Okay? Gender identity is culture based. It is based on the society that you live in, right? And we can think of this as what it means to be a woman here in even in New York means something different than what it means to be a woman in Africa, or a woman even in Texas. I mean, like even in another state, right? The norms that go into what it means to be female, what it means to be a young girl, are different based on geography, based on the people you're surrounded by, and all of that informs how you feel about gender. Okay. But the bottom line is that gender is internal, okay? It is not your body, it is internal. And sometimes these two things match up and are on the same side based on society standards, and sometimes they are not, okay? Moving forward, gender expression. Gender expression is how you present yourself to the world, okay? It's your clothing, it's the way you cut your hair, it's your name, because names are gendered. It's your pronouns, because pronouns are gendered, right? It's your occupation. It's the way that you talk. It's all of those things, right? It's the external cues you give to somebody that says, this may or may not be my gender, okay? It's your gender expression. So sometimes people who are assigned female at birth, who identify as female, present femininely, right? Sometimes people who are assigned female at birth, who identify as female, present masculinely, right? And we know these people. They never wear makeup, and they never wear heels, and they're always wearing football jerseys, and they're a mechanic or whatever they're doing in life, right? And they have a gender neutral name. Maybe they go by Chris. But we don't see that person and say, oh, because you're masculine, you're not a female, right? We don't say that. We say you're a woman because you say so, right? Same thing for trans people, right? If they're, regardless of how they express themselves and regardless of what words they use as their pronouns, if they say they are something, they are something, okay? And that's a key point of being an ally, right? If I wake up tomorrow and say I want to use she, her pronouns, it doesn't make me any less non-binary. It doesn't make me any less trans. Okay. Similarly, if I grow out my hair or whatever, right? My expression doesn't change who I am. And then the last point I'm going to make is just the fact that that everybody, trans people included, have sexual and romantic attraction. Okay. And that it doesn't, sometimes trans people are like sterilized in society. You know, it's like, you're trans, therefore you're not gay, therefore you're not straight, therefore, you know, but every single person still has a relationship to gender and sex. So I'm not going to focus on gender and sex, but sex and romanticism is what I was saying. I'm not going to focus on this because I want to get into it, into other things further. But as we continue, I just want to make a point, because as we're talking about trans identities and we're talking about pronouns, especially, I want to kind of send home a point about being trans is not a monolith. Of course, it's just like being any type of other person, you know? So there is often a misconception that to be trans, you need to do certain things, and that's not true, right? So there are different buckets of transition. There's social transition, which is coming out. It's saying in your social circle, hey, use this name, use this pronouns. It's even changing your clothing. All of that is social transition. There's hormonal transition, legal transition, medical and surgical transition, right? And you can do all of these things as a trans person, or you could do none of them and still be trans, okay? Or one of them, or two of them, or do one and then 20 years later do the next one, right? You don't have to do any of these things. If you're trans, right? If you say so, then you are. So, but in terms of pronouns, oftentimes one of the first things that people do is change their name and is change their pronouns and is come out in a social setting, right? So as allies, as aspiring allies, what we want to do is honor that, because that's scary. And that's often the first thing that people do, to say, hey, world, look, I'm trans, and please honor that. And so we just want to make sure that we do that. So even if it's hard and even if it's new, right, that we're going to do that. Before we jump into pronouns, we're going to pause really quick and see if there's questions. Like 5 minutes or so. Let me know when it's paused.
So I'm going to go ahead and pause our recording.
All right, so everybody can see this, yeah? Okay, so I'm going to pass the mic over to Kira.
Hello. So in this section, we're going to start getting into what gendered language is, and finally, like what pronouns actually are, what are neopronouns, and get into the meat of what we're all here for, which is pronouns. So we can move on to the next slide. So what is gendered language actually? I think a good place to start is with what we already know. A lot of us are already used to avoiding gendered language that erases or minimizes the place of cisgender women in our society. So we try to say things like police officer instead of policeman, try to say things like humanity instead of mankind. But how do gender fluidity and non-binary identities complicate that understanding we have of gendered language? Under the view that I just described, a phrase like brothers and sisters wouldn't be considered gendered in an offensive way since it doesn't exclude women, right? But we can now understand that this language does exclude gender nonconforming folks and anyone who doesn't identify along the binary. So similar examples to that are phrases like sons and daughters and boys and girls and men and women. Those types of phrases, kind of assume that we're going to fall into one of two categories. What we're learning today is that there's a lot more than that. So we can move on to the next slide. So here we just have some more examples of gendered words. Yeah, and in addition to these, there are lots of casual phrases that use gendered language, phrases like you guys and dude and man. And those phrases are often used sometimes in a gender neutral way, but they can still kind of put trans folks or folks who don't identify with those words on the spot, make them feel uncomfortable. So I think it's usually best to try to, just like we would avoid saying mailman, we want to avoid using some of those terms generally, especially when we know we're in the room with transgender non-conforming folks. But even when we're not, just to be exclusive, so you might say something to be inclusive, sorry, not exclusive. So you might say something like y'all instead of you guys. And that can kind of help to diffuse that and take us away from constantly gendering what we're talking about when we're talking to others. We talk about gendered language because pronouns are one major aspect of language that is gendered. We sometimes don't realize how much we use them, but they're totally there. So let's get into what pronouns actually are. So we all use pronouns in our daily lives, as Shepard was saying. We learned about this in second grade, but for clarity, we have the formal definition up here. They're basically just a useful way to refer to people that function like nouns and refer to certain people that are being discussed in the conversation. The most common ones we use regularly are she, he, and they. And so the examples of those are up on the screen right now. But I think for now we can move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about neopronouns, which are newer pronouns, hence the name. And they're becoming more widely used because they're often used to help folks express an identity that fall outside of the gender binary. So these ones you might not have seen. So up here right now, we have sie, them, zir. We have sie, here, heres, they, fair, fairs, and am, air. And so if you're confused about how to pronounce these, if you're like really rattled about them, we'll definitely talk about them and get into them more. But for now, we can move on to the next slide. And we have just like a few more examples of those same pronouns. And yeah. So here we have their pronunciations again. We have them in a couple more sentences. So definitely if you have questions about these, pop them into the chat, hold them until we break for questions later. We can talk about them more. So we move on. So we want to talk a little bit about why all of this is so important, right? So we've already talked about gender identity, what it means, how it relates to people, how people express it. So pronouns are names, and pronouns and names are kind of fundamental to our identities and who we are. They might not always indicate exactly what our gender identity is, but they can reflect it and they can affirm it. So when we're called by a name or pronoun that isn't our own, it can feel bad and read as disrespectful. And this isn't a thing that only trans people experience, right? I think lots of people have had the experience of like being on the phone with customer service and they say sir or ma'am when you don't identify that way, and that can feel bad, right? And so that's something that trans folks and folks in the community experience a lot. So just as we would respect a friend who asked us to use a nickname or learn the name of a friend who's changed it for marriage, we also want to show that same respect to trans people who are requesting us to call them what they want to be called. From a young age, like other folks under the LGBTQ+ umbrella, we're taught that our transness is something to fear and hide, or even something that doesn't exist. when someone makes the choice not to bother learning a person's new name or pronouns, they're kind of affirming that message that our transness doesn't exist or that it needs to be hidden. And the impacts of this are clear. Again, it might kind of seem like a small thing, but it can have a huge impact on people's well-being and their psyche. A recent San Francisco State University study showed the impact that family acceptance can have on LGBT youth rates of suicide. While there isn't similar research on the effects of acceptance in the workplace or the school, it's reasonable to assume that acceptance in other contexts can also have a positive or negative impact on people's well-being. So being nice might seem like a trifle, but it can be life-changing for a trans person. This past weekend, we just had our Transgender Day of Remembrance to remember, the memories of trans folks whose lives have been lost in the past year. So I think it's important to keep in mind, like, just how impactful it can be on a person's emotional well-being, how intense the effects can be when people are constantly misgendering them and constantly using a name that doesn't align with who they are. So moving on to the next slide. Before we get into like practicing pronouns and talking a little bit more about how we ask people pronouns and those kind of practical nitty-gritty things, I wanted to talk a little bit about pronoun fluidity, how it relates to coming out, and kind of just the different ways that people in the community might relate to pronouns. So, we're talking about the kind of main ways that people relate to pronouns, the main ways people use them, but this is kind of complicating that and introducing the fact that different trans people feel different ways about pronouns, and you might encounter that, as you go about your work or just your life. So the concept of pronoun fluidity is related to how many trans folks use multiple or no pronouns. So in the case of using no pronouns, a person may just want you to use their name instead of their pronoun. So we're going to talk a little bit later about how for folks who do use a single pronoun or who use like a particular set of pronouns, using their name instead of their pronoun can be offensive or annoying, can be like grating to them. But there are some people who actually want you to use their name instead of their pronoun. And that can be confusing, right? That they're like different people who have different relationships to these things. They're asking you to use pronouns and words in different ways. And I think the best kind of way to go about this, and my golden rule that I say in every training, is to just respect what people are asking you to call them and respect people's own wishes. I think if you go with that most of the time, you're gonna come out all right, because different people are gonna feel different ways about these things. And part of being a good ally is allowing for people to be different from one another, right? Trans folks aren't monoliths, we're not all the same. And so we want to acknowledge that. So this concept of pronoun fluidity is, I think, especially important when we're talking about coming out. So there's this idea of outing by asking, right? And it means that for some trans folks, they don't like being asked their pronouns because they feel like the process identifies them as transgender, or maybe they themselves don't use pronouns like I just mentioned. Maybe they use some of the neopronouns that we just had up on the screen, and they don't want to explain that to a whole group of people. Or they might just not have a pronoun preference, and now you're kind of putting them on the spot and asking them to choose a pronoun. So that's why, we might encounter actually trans folks who are uncomfortable answering that question. And I think this is especially true in group settings, especially in group settings that are mostly cis-dominated. So I hear this a lot from folks who are in school or college, something I experienced where like a class of mostly cisgender folks might be going around and saying their pronouns. And then the one trans person in the class is then put on the spot and asked to reveal themselves. So I think especially in those types of settings, it's best to always stress that people don't have to share their pronouns if it makes them uncomfortable. And the issues of outing by asking in pronoun fluidity are particularly important when someone is coming out, because very often a person's pronouns will be most fluid and changing when they're first coming out and figuring out their gender identity. And even for folks who are changing their pronouns or names at different points in their journey, it's kind of always a sensitive subject. So we just always want to be mindful of it. While it can be difficult to keep up as a person's pronouns or names change, we want to keep in mind that that process is even more overwhelming and confusing for the person going through it, right? So being respectful and patient as people change, grow, and experiment is an important way to be affirming. It's also important to be understanding and respectful if a person doesn't wish to share their pronouns when you ask. And we're going to talk about how you asked and what you do in different situations going into the next section. guess we can move on. Okay, so yeah, we're going to be talking about in this section asking for pronouns, how that works. We're going to talk a little bit about memorizing pronouns, and then we're going to break for questions so that you all can, engage in discussion with us and work out any issues you might have with what's come up. So to start off, we're going to have here a pretty standard way to ask someone's pronouns on the slide. So Sam says, my name is Sam. I use she, her pronouns. How should I refer to you? So go on to the next slide. Jake says, hey, Sam, I'm Jake. My pronouns are they, them. So this is a friendly way to answer the question. It's great, but it's not always that easy, right? So moving on to the next slide. So next the question again, I use she, her pronouns. How should I refer to you? This time Jake says, hi, Sam, I'm Jake. So they didn't offer their pronouns, and we don't exactly know why, right? You might be able to tell if you're in the room with Jake and able to read them, but we can't be fully sure. With everything that I was just talking about some trans folks being uncomfortable with sharing their pronouns, you don't know what you're dealing with. So depending on the situation, you might either rephrase the question and choose to ask it, or you might choose to ask it later on in the conversation, depending on the situation. So move on to the next scenario. So Sam once again says, I use she, her pronouns. How should I refer to you? And here we have like a slightly more hostile response, right? They're pushing back on the question. It's possible that the person is offended or that they just don't know what you mean, right? And I think it's important that we don't make assumptions here, right? So Jake might be transphobic and they don't want to talk about pronouns and they're mad about that you're asking about pronouns, right? But they also, like I just said, might be a trans person who's uncomfortable. They might just not really know what you mean. They might not be familiar with the concept of asking people for pronouns at all. So we don't want to make any assumptions off the bat. So, we have Sam responding with, I don't like to make assumptions. We ask this question to everyone. And responding calmly like that and explaining that, I think, can sometimes defuse the situation. And then depending on their response to Jake's response afterwards, the conversation will go in a few different directions, right? But we don't want to make any assumptions off the bat. And we also want to emphasize that this is a question that we're asking to everyone because we're trying to make it more of a universal thing that even cisgender people introduce themselves with their pronouns so that we're not assuming that. So moving on to the next slide. So before we get into questions, I wanted to just go through some ways to memorize people's pronouns because I know it can be overwhelming, especially, in contexts like the workplace or doing work or, any situation where you might need to learn the person's pronouns very quickly and you really don't want to mix them up. So a common method of remembering names that you might have heard of is to repeat it once when someone first tells you, once during the conversation, and once as you leave. So that gives you 3 times to kind of embed the name in your mind and associate it with that person. And the same principles apply when you're learning someone's pronouns or their new chosen name. So you can repeat that person's pronouns in conversation when you first hear them. You can recite the person's pronouns in your mind when you look at them, when you pass them in the hallway, whatever. If you text or call the person often, you can include their pronouns in their name on your phone. You could also do that in your email contacts or wherever they may show up electronically. And then if you're in close contact with that person regularly, you really need to memorize their pronouns or name quickly. It can be helpful to practice reciting their pronouns while looking at a picture of them. Sounds kind of creepy. It sounds like maybe you're making a shrine to them and chanting, but for real, like if you need to learn someone's pronouns and names really quickly and it's important to you that you don't offend them, that you don't hurt their feelings, and this is especially relevant in the workplace context, you want to do what you can to memorize them. And creating that association in your mind, however you can, is really the way to do it. I also wanted to talk a little bit about what not to do, right? So we don't want to use someone's name in lieu of any pronouns at all. It can seem appealing, but it's counterproductive in a number of ways. Now, obviously, this doesn't apply to people who are asking you to refer to them by their names, right? So I mentioned that earlier, but for a lot of trans folks who identify with a particular pronoun or a particular set of pronouns, using their name constantly can be kind of grating and obvious. It also prevents you from learning the person's pronouns because you're never actually trying to use them when you're talking to the person. We just talked about how associating person's pronouns with themselves, with their name, is really important. But if you're constantly using their name instead of their pronouns, it kind of prevents you from ever associating their pronouns with that person. And it really wastes your opportunity to practice their pronouns. And then the other like bigger reason this is a misstep is that it doesn't actually show respect to the person in question, right? It's quite easy to notice. I think Shepard and I have both been in the position ourselves where we've heard similar stories from other trans folks. That the constant use of a name in sentences that would normally use a pronoun is grating, obvious, and it can be an unwelcome reminder of our identity and the adversity we face. Because pronouns are so baked into our language, like I said before, we don't always recognize how often we use them, but when you start using someone's name instead of pronouns, it becomes very obvious. The other thing you're going to want to avoid is using they when someone requests a neopronoun or a binary gender pronoun like she or he. So when someone requests a neopronoun, they're likely doing it for personal, well-thought-out reasons. And making the effort to learn the new words is kind of the least we can do to support someone's well-being, right? And then when someone suggests a binary gender pronoun, it's because they identify with that gender strongly and they want to be recognized as such. So using they repeatedly to describe a binary trans person can be an unwelcome reminder of their gender nonconformity. Now, it sometimes is better to use they in a situation when you're not sure of someone's pronouns or you haven't yet memorized them. It's okay to do in situations that call for it, but it's important to make a proactive effort to learn the actual requested pronouns of the people around you if you really want to be respectful. I think I and a lot of other folks use they as a kind of gender neutral default, and that's totally fine. But we also want to be making the effort to learn a person's actual pronouns because we want to be respectful of them and we want to be affirming of how they refer to themselves. So that is it, I think, for our quick run through of practicing memorizing pronouns, practicing asking for pronouns. But I know there are probably a lot of questions, a lot of things come up. So we can open things up, right, Shepard?
All right, and Shepard and Kira, you can both continue.
Yeah, we are finished.
Excellent.
Yes.
So can you pull up the slide that has your contact information? I think that would be helpful for everyone to see before we all leave you today, just in case they have any questions. Also, as a reminder to everyone, I will be sending out the slides and the sheet that Shepard was just referencing with regard to the neopronouns practice. And I will also be sending out the recording from today, just in case anyone was on and wants to forward it to a colleague who perhaps wanted to join us but missed it. And I will also be sending out a survey just to get ideas for future professional development events, if there are any topics that everyone is interested in, or if you would like to hear more about LGBTQ plus competency or more about pronouns, please feel free to utilize the survey to let us know what it is that you want to hear more about. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us, and a huge thank you to our presenters, Shepard and Kira. I really appreciate it. The information is invaluable, and I have to say that we received such an overwhelming response to this professional development event, and so that's great news. So thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, this is wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Stay well and take care. Bye-bye.